The parlor was a museum of a life Clara no longer recognized as her own. Dust danced in the shafts of dim yellow light. The air hung thick with the cloying scent of stale lavender and the damp, earthy smell of old oak furniture. Arthur sat anchored in the emerald velvet armchair. He didn't move, his presence a dark weight that seemed to pull the oxygen from the room. Clara's hands trembled slightly as she lifted the porcelain teapot. The silence between them was not a void, but a living thing, heavy and expectant. Arthur watched her every movement with eyes that were cold and unblinking, yet his face wore a mask of gentle concern that made her skin crawl even as it confused her heart. As she set the tea down, Clara's gaze drifted to the mantelpiece. The mahogany clock, a family heirloom that had stood centered for 40 years, was off. It had been moved exactly 3 inches to the left, leaving a faint, pale rectangle on the wood where its base usually rested. "Arthur," she whispered. "Why did you move the clock?" Arthur's lips curled into a thin, patient smile. He didn't look at the mantel. "I didn't move anything, Clara. It has always been there." He leaned forward, his voice a soothing velvet trap. "You're just tired, my dear. You probably bumped it yourself when you were dusting earlier." Clara looked at the pale mark, her mind reeling with a sudden, sharp doubt. Later, Arthur was in the hallway, kneeling with a small toolbox. Without being asked, he began to work on a loose floorboard that had groaned under Clara's weight for months. He worked with a fluid, practiced grace. When he finished, the board was perfectly silent. He looked up at her, wiping his brow with a gesture so humble it felt like a gift. "There," he said softly. "You won't have to worry about tripping anymore." Clara felt a sharp pang of guilt. She hadn't even realized how much that noise had bothered her until he took the burden away. He was so helpful, so attentive to the small cracks in her life. They sat together as shadows stretched across the floral carpet. Arthur began to speak of his childhood, a tale of a lonely boy who felt invisible. He spoke of his insecurities, his voice trembling at just the right moments. As Clara leaned in, moved by his apparent honesty, she didn't notice that Arthur was mirroring her every move. When she crossed her ankles, he did the same. It was a silent, hypnotic dance that created an artificial sense of profound connection. She felt as though she had finally found a soulmate, someone who understood the deep, quiet ache of being misunderstood. But the warmth was soon chilled. Arthur mentioned a conversation with Mrs. Higgins from next door. "She seemed concerned, Clara," he said with pity. "She mentioned you seemed distant, forgetful. She asked if everything was all right with your head." Clara's heart hammered. She hadn't spoken to the neighbor in weeks. "I don't remember seeing her," she stammered. Arthur sighed, a heavy, disappointed sound. "That's exactly what I mean, darling. You're losing track of the days. It's lucky I'm here to help you keep things straight." The atmosphere shifted, the walls pulsing with restrictive energy. Arthur insisted on drawing the heavy curtains tight. "The sun will ruin the furniture," he explained, though the room grew tomb-like. Isolated from the street, Clara felt the world outside dissolving into a grey blur, leaving her alone with a man who claimed to know her better than she knew herself. Before we continue, subscribe to the channel and tell us in the comments where you are watching from. Driven by a desperate need for grounding, Clara went to her study to find her diary. She needed her own words to prove her memories were real. But the drawer was empty. Behind her, a shadow fell across the desk. Arthur stood there holding a cup of tea, his face a mask of serene curiosity. "Are you looking for something, Clara?" he asked, his voice dropping to a low, chilling whisper. "Perhaps something you never actually owned in the first place." Arthur was no longer a guest. He had become the silent conductor of the household's very rhythm. He decided when the morning began and when the day finally surrendered to the night. He moved through the hallway with a ghost-like efficiency, flicking the brass switches of the lamps before Clara even realized the sun had set. If the radio played, it was always the soft, melancholic jazz he preferred, even when the static made Clara's head throb. Whenever she reached to change the station, his hand firmly covered hers. "The music is for your nerves, Clara," he would whisper. "We both know how easily you get overstimulated these days." It wasn't an order. It was an act of care, a cage built of soft words. Whenever frustration bubbled inside her, Arthur remained an island of unnerving tranquility. He would sit perfectly still, watching her trembling hands with an expression of saint-like patience. He had stopped using "you" in isolation, replacing it with a collective "we" that served as a subtle linguistic erasure of her identity. "We don't want to get upset over nothing, do we?" he would ask, his voice a melodic hum. By merging their identities, he made her anger feel like a personal betrayal of their shared peace. If she cried, he drew her into a suffocating embrace until she heard only his heart, making her feel that her own emotions were wild animals that only he could domesticate. The shift in power became most visible in the parlor. Clara's father had always occupied the high-backed wing chair, a seat of absolute authority that had remained vacant since his passing. Without a word, Arthur simply sat in it. He didn't ask. He claimed the space as if it were his birthright. He draped his long arms over the rests, looking as though he had been carved from the same heavy oak as the chair itself. At first, Clara felt a sharp jolt of sacrilege, but the words died in her throat. His presence became the new gravity of the room. He occupied the space so completely that the memory of her father began to blur, replaced by the man watching from the shadows. The kitchen became a landscape of subtle traps. She would reach for the salt shaker, only to find the contents had been replaced with sugar. The resulting meal would be a ruined, cloying mess. Arthur would watch her take a bite, his own plate significantly untouched, and let out a long sigh of pity. "Oh, Clara," he would say, shaking his head. "Not again. You were so sure you grabbed the salt." He would gently take the spoon from her hand, his eyes filled with a terrifying compassion. "It's the forgetfulness, darling. It's getting worse. But don't worry, I'll take care of the mess. Go and rest your tired head." Isolation deepened when a sharp knock echoed through the house. It was a sound of the outside world, a lifeline Clara felt a desperate urge to grasp. She stood up, her heart racing, but Arthur was faster. He was already at the door, blocking the view of the porch. He opened it only a crack, leaning out to speak in a low whisper. When he closed it, his face was a mask of regret. "Who was it?" she asked. "No one of importance," he replied, guiding her back. "Just a solicitor. I told him you weren't well. We need our privacy." He severed the last thread connecting her to the neighborhood, leaving her adrift in the quiet. Slowly, the world narrowed until it contained only Arthur. Clara stood before the wardrobe, unable to choose a dress until he pointed toward the navy wool. She wouldn't even pour a glass of water without glancing at him for a nod of approval. His dominance was no longer a threat. It had become a safety net. In the fog of her supposed memory loss, his certainty was the only solid ground. She began to view his commands as protection, his constant surveillance as devotion. If he controlled everything, she no longer had to fear making a mistake. She was becoming a child again, and he was the guardian of her crumbling reality. The illusion shattered late one night. Arthur had fallen asleep in the father's chair, his breathing deep and rhythmic. His heavy coat was draped over a dining chair. Driven by a ghost of her former curiosity, Clara reached into the inner pocket. Her fingers brushed against a scrap of paper. Pulling it out, she retreated to the dim light of the kitchen. It was a list, written in Arthur's precise handwriting. It detailed her daily habits, her deepest fears, and her favorite memories. The dates were from months before they had ever met. It was a script, a blueprint of her soul. She stood in the dark, the paper trembling, realizing her soulmate had been a predator long before he ever became her savior. The paper in Clara's hand felt like a shard of ice, burning her palm with the cold truth. The kitchen now looked like a sterile laboratory where she had been the subject of an experiment that had consumed her identity. She scanned the list again, the notes on how she liked her tea, the dates of her deepest grief, her recurring nightmares about drowning birds. It was mapped out with clinical detachment. The realization that her entire romance was a calculated siege struck her with a force that made her breath hitch in her throat. She wasn't a partner. She was a project being slowly completed by a master craftsman. Suddenly, a yellow light from the hallway spilled across the linoleum, casting a distorted shadow. Arthur stood there, his silhouette filling the frame. He didn't look angry. He looked disappointed, like a collector finding a scratch on a prized porcelain doll. He walked toward her, his footsteps silent. He took the paper from her trembling fingers and tucked it away. "You weren't supposed to find that yet, Clara," he said, his voice smooth and devoid of remorse. "It was meant to be a record of how much I've studied you to ensure your absolute happiness." Clara backed away, her hips hitting the edge of the heavy dining table. "I want to leave," she whispered, her voice cracking under the weight of the air. "I'm going to the station. I'm leaving this house." She made a sudden move toward the door, but Arthur simply stood in her path. He didn't need to use force. "Go then," he said softly, his blue eyes fixed on hers. "But do you remember the last time you tried to navigate the city alone? The panic that seized you at the station? The way the doctor said your nerves were too fragile for the noise?" Clara froze. She searched for the memory of a doctor, but it was hazy, obscured by the fog he had created. His absolute conviction made a phantom weight settle in her chest. Her legs felt like lead, anchored by the stories he had woven into her mind. She looked around the room, and the 1950s decor finally felt like a tomb. The furniture wasn't her legacy. It was a stage set he had built to keep her helpless. Every piece of furniture was a silent sentry reporting her every movement. The house was a museum of her erasure. Arthur saw the rebellion dying in her eyes, replaced by defeat. He knelt before her, taking her cold hands in his. His touch now felt like the rhythmic tightening of a snare. "The world is loud and cruel, Clara. It doesn't understand you. They would see your confusion and treat you like a broken thing. Here, you are cherished. I am the only one who can keep you sane." He looked up with eyes that were devoid of warmth. He was her architect, and he was finally putting the roof on her cage. In the hallway mirror, Clara saw a woman she didn't recognize. Her hair was perfectly pinned, but her eyes were hollowed out. She saw the predator behind his mask, the calculation in his thin smile. But the effort to hold on to that truth was too much. To survive, her brain began to shut out the horror, replacing the predator with a savior because the alternative was too terrifying to bear. Arthur led her back and sat her in the velvet chair. He picked up a silver brush and began to stroke her hair with hypnotic precision. "You're so lucky I found you," he whispered. Clara closed her eyes, a single tear tracing a path down her cheek. It wasn't grief, but surrender to his will. The clock on the mantel ticked away the seconds of a life that no longer belonged to her. The doors were unlocked, the windows were glass, but she would never leave. The mind needs no iron bars to keep it prisoner.